Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, my friend, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What have you brought to the table today?
Yeah, I brought a couple of articles from the Forge's issue on the state of abolition.
Yes.
As I said last week, for those listening along at home, the first one is called After the Uprising in DC and Beyond by Makia Green. And the second is called What Time Is It on the Clock of Abolitionist Organizing by Andrea Ritchie. So Makia Green is based in D.C. down the street.
Yes.
They work for the Working Families Party and Harriet's Wildest Dreams, which is an abolitionist community defense hub in D.C. And Andrea Ritchie co-founded Interrupting Criminalization and the In Our Names Network, which is a collective of organizations that are working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. And these two articles, I think, are really great snapshots of what's been accomplished by abolitionist organizing and sort of where the movement is as a whole.
Right.
There are some really clear-eyed, I think, critiques of what has been happening and some great questions about what's next or what could be next that abolitionists have to grapple with collectively.
Yeah.
And I think some direction provided, like some guidance or potential pathways
to consider
for folks to follow.
Absolutely.
I thought they were really great articles and really good reads. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the articles too, because I only had time to do the two that we read.
Yes. I'm surprised you were able to identify just two. There's the state of abolition issue is like full of, there had to be at least 10 or so.
Yeah. I just didn't click on the other one. I found two that looked great.
Yeah, and they were.
Tried to ignore the rest, which I apologize for. To the other articles.
We'll get to them.
Didn't mean to hurt their feelings.
We'll absolutely get to them.
We will.
But yeah, these two were great. I'm really excited for us to talk about them, and particularly just for us to continue to talk about abolition in all the ways in which we believe that, it's the only way forward to sort of see this idea of true freedom, true liberation for all of us. And so love these pieces. We'll revisit the other ones.
Yeah.
One of the things that stood out to me sort of out of the gate in Andrea Ritchie's remarks, because these were sort of an edited version of her remarks from this Allied Media Conference that I think speak to this is the fact that abolitionist organizers have secured some major victories over the past couple of years, which is awesome. And as she puts it, they've shifted the national conversation around what true public safety should be, and the fact that what we have now isn't that.
Correct.
And so that included things like building and cultivating relationships with communities affected by oppressive systems and engaging the community in this political education, right? Like they've spent so much time, organizers have spent so much time engaging people on the streets in their homes in this political education, which is so important. They've forced elected officials and policymakers and state governments to shift our money, to shift our tax dollars right up to around $1 billion out of police budgets, which is just awesome. They've increased investments in cities across the country and in violence prevention measures and crisis response and housing and guaranteed income and sort of these public safety initiatives and measures that really is what our communities need over policing. And so that's just really good stuff, right? It's so good to see that highlighted. I love when, we read these pieces and we're sort of confronted with the victories of this this organizing work of abolitionist organizers. And I think it's fuel for them to continue to do more. It's fuel for us to support this work. And it's a reminder, I think, of what can happen in more places across the country.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that they... part of the articles, I think, name that. These things are happening in these little pockets. People are also doing it in other places, but facing more resistance or not able to accomplish the same kind of things, depending on how long they've been on the ground or what other kind of like context it is they're working in.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's no hiding it or sugarcoating it. Like, it's hard work, right? It's not easy. In a lot of places, there's, as you say, a lot of sort of things standing in the way of of the work. Absolutely.
Yeah, and even the concept of changing how we think about public safety.
Yeah.
That's in and of itself a lot of work because we are so invested and attached in the current model of policing.
Yeah.
And I say we as, a culture, as a society.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so one of the things that stuck out to me from the Andrea Ritchie piece was this list of things that abolitionists forced policymakers to do in the wake of the uprisings in 2020, which, are also continuations of previous uprisings.
Yes,
right?
of
These
course.
things are all connected throughout history, whether they are intentionally connected or not. They all call back in some way to each other.
Absolutely.
Because these things repeat themselves. But so she listed these things: forced policymakers to contend with our demands,
Yep.
justify police budgets that had previously been passed largely without any justification at all, attempt to absorb and co-opt our demands, mount a massive public relations campaign to delegitimize our demands and visions, and re-legitimize police. And so these are big accomplishments in and of themselves. And you talk about like hearing things that are, or have like really enjoying and appreciating hearing victories.
Yes.
I think these are huge victories in shifting the culture and conversation around these ideas.
Yes.
It's a shift in the overton window, which is a concept about what is actually politically possible in a
Yes.
society or government. And so if you change what's acceptable to talk about, you change what's possible to do.
I love that.
And there are tons of ways that we see governments start to then, we saw governments start to then criticize and attack these demands.
Yeah.
Which means they saw them as a real threat or as something to contend with.
Right.
Instead of being something on the fringe that you don't have to pay attention to. Right. So the way that it moved to now have to take up so much attention from the right, from the Republican candidates, to then having to be defended, or having Democrats having to defend themselves and their records as being pro police and not defund and whatever. All of that is a huge shift in the culture, in our collective understanding and sort of connection to what abolition might look like.
Absolutely. Well, and it's, that reminds me just of this idea of like challenging the status quo and how dangerous that is to the right. And so, yeah, I appreciated Andrea's thoughtfulness and sort of acknowledgement that these victories have come alongside or in the face of, in spite of, these campaigns to delegitimize their work, and to attack them, to attack the people, to attack the individuals, to attack the organizers, to attack the goal, the mission. And so, you have to acknowledge the victories, but this piece I think reminds us so brilliantly of the struggle associated with it. And I love that Overton window concept. That's one I had not heard of. So thanks for teaching me something today.
Yeah.
The Andrea Ritchie piece was so good, right? Her talk was really good. I appreciated so much about it. I really appreciated her reminder of how important it is for us to remain vigilant in coming up with abolitionist strategies and policy solutions that not only work, but are also just aren't reforms or alternatives to what we currently have. And we've talked about this concept before. We read, I think, Interrupting Criminalization's piece about this, right? And so
she referred to it.
She refers to it in her remarks.
Is this policy or practice actually abolitionist?
Abolitionist, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such an important piece of the evolution of this work for abolition. So she points out that as our demands have evolved, given sort of the current state of our country, the attacks from the right we've talked about the past few weeks, she points out that we should recenter certain questions to make sure our goals are in alignment with abolitionist views and values. And so, and you talked about this, right? Like things to consider. And so there were these three questions that I wrote down. Well, three questions with some sub-questions. Are we demanding to move money to state entities like public housing, public hospitals, public benefits programs, et cetera, or to community-based programs? If the latter, how do we guard against community-based programs becoming extensions of the carceral state? Number two, how do we understand and resist policing and the ways it operates through all arms of the carceral state, including those that distribute benefits and resources, and in our community organizations and programs? And number three was, are we willing to engage with the state by meeting with council members, participating in public task forces, et cetera? Are we valuing political purity over making strategic moves based on our political analysis and power mapping? And so I appreciated those questions. I appreciated sort of this idea that these are just three big questions among probably plenty of questions out there that like should be considered. But it's a good baseline and a good exercise, I think a really impactful exercise to engage in as we can sort of continue this work, as abolitionist organizers continue this work that needs to happen.
Yeah, those questions are great. I think her remarks in particular had a lot of really great questions and bullet points throughout that just were like, here is the point that I am making.
Yes.
And laid it out very plainly to the audience she was speaking to.
It was great.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the Makia Green article.
Yeah, we should. Absolutely.
One of the things that stuck out to me was this part about what elected leaders did in the wake of demands to defund and abolish police. So they said, quote, as elected leaders buckled to right-wing scare tactics, what did it win them? Ultimately, activists trusted them less, and right-wing media still calls them woke, while actively working to disenfranchise Democratic voters across the country. And I think that's such an important piece of analysis because ultimately so many of these elected people are no longer trusted.
Yeah.
By anybody who is sort of considered progressive now. And it's not just police abolition that led to this breakdown in trust, obviously, but a whole constellation of issues that I think are interconnected, economy stuff, environmental things, all kinds of stuff. But the whole point of this is that if your base no longer trusts you to act on their behalf, where are you then?
Yes.
What do you now have as a platform to operate? And who trusts you to do anything? And then how is that also then eroding trust further in government itself?
Wow.
So there's a lot, I think, to unpack there for elected officials who are like, no, I'm not defund. I want to fund the police. Joe Biden. So, I think those are important things for us to grapple with and consider. And then what do we do with that as a public? If we have all these politicians we no longer trust who are in office, what do we do with them? How do you work with them, or how do you push them into something that is, closer to what you and your people believe,
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I love that analysis you bring there, and sort of this idea of how are we working with our elected officials, and what do we expect of them? What do we demand of them? And what do we do when they're not meeting our demands, when they're not serving us in the ways that they should? Yeah, this piece, Makia Green's piece, was fantastic. I think it was, for me, it was just a really great reflection on the abolitionist movement in the years since 2020. And so one of the reflections that I think I appreciated them naming was the sort of incredible challenges that abolitionist organizers faced, right? Especially with the work of the right-wing fascists and what they've done to sort of poke at the work and the successes of the abolitionist movement. And so Makia said, quote, the anti-safety, pro-police machine spent millions on lobbying and persuading voters to withdraw support of abolitionist solutions. And although they convinced a large portion of voters to support continued funding of police, what the data also shows is that Black voters know that policing is not a solution to the harm we face in our neighborhoods. Black voters are begging for an alternative they can trust. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I really loved that and loved that they have this data. And I appreciated that Makia Green and their organizations, so this is Defund MPD Coalition, Harriet's Wildest Dreams, what you mentioned earlier, and I'm sure others, that they've advocated for and done, and what they've done here in DC in our backyard, and based off of what real Black people here know what we need. So I think there's so many great lessons in what has been accomplished here in DC that can be applied elsewhere, right? And that's a point I sort of tried to make earlier too. It certainly hasn't been easy. There have been setbacks, but as Makia mentions, some of those, it's just worth it. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's long-term work.
Yeah.
It is base building, it's political education, it's all these things. It's imagining what kind of structures we can build that actually address public safety.
Yes.
Or something. I think Miriam Kaba has an article in the State of Abolition issue as well. I think I did skim that one. And they, Miriam frames it not as public safety, but as well-being. Because public safety has been so, she said, colonized by,
I was going to say co-opted,
like the right and sort of the pro-police machine, as Makia says. Here.
Which is such a shame, right? Like this concept of public safety. Like, how are we colonizing that? Like, why? It's a shame that happens when if we can really, if instead we could just all sit down and really talk about what this is and what people really need.
I feel that 100%. And I appreciate the way that she sort of flips it on its head and says, let's talk about well-being. Like, what does well-being mean? Because that includes your physical safety, your emotional safety, all of that stuff too. So, yeah,
she's brilliant.
Indeed. Hey, Damien.
Hey, Aaron.
You know what's coming up?
What's that?
At least once this unseasonable heat wave ends.
Okay.
It's my favorite season.
Ooh.
The fall of the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. October.
Yes.
And with that comes some cooler temperatures, and as the cool kids call it, sweater weather or hoodie season.
I love sweater weather. That's right. This is the best season, the
Indeed.
fall, as you call it. And if you didn't know, folks listening, we've got a merch store where you can get a hoodie for the fall.
Indeed.
In fact, we've got lots of great apparel for the fall. We've got a few hoodies on our site, a long sleeve shirt, a nice pair of jogger pants, and even a mug for your hot cocoa or whatever you want to put in that thing.
Indeed. And if you buy something now with promo code 15 off, that's 150FF, you'll get 15% off your total purchase. And you can use that code up until October 31st. So go ahead and get cozy for spooky season.
Hashtag spooky season. I love it. Just visit our website, interdependentstudy.com, and click the merch link on the top menu, and you'll be transported directly to our store. And don't forget to use the promo code 15 off.
Man, I can't wait to see all this merch out there in the wild.
I love it.
All right, well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
How do these articles here apply to our day-to-day lives? So I've got one thing from each article for application.
Okay.
So first, Andrea Ritchie asked some really great questions, as we have said, that I think guide the next steps of abolitionist movement work. So the question is this: how can we meet what is to come or already here? How are we connecting across movements and translocally to build power, skills, relationships, and structures to resist state repression and white supremacist violence, reduce suffering, and ensure the survival of the greatest number of people we care about through what is to come? So great questions.
Yes.
Huge questions about how we sort of face the things that are at our doorstep or will be at our doorstep soon. And how do we come together as a large coalition to try to reduce that suffering, to have us survive as many of us survive as possible. And it points to power building within organizations that can bring people in to practice these abolitionist ideas together, which
we know is so important.
It's beautiful in a lot of ways. And so Makia Green said, quote, "We cannot accept proposals where these programs are funded with only private and temporary funding. We also shouldn't support programs funded by discriminatory fines or cuts to social housing, public education, affirmative action, or student debt relief. Our movement deserves the same level of massive, dedicated public funding that current systems have had for more than a century."
Yes.
And I think that's such a great practical way to keep things moving forward. Don't accept half steps that compromise the larger project and strategy and ultimately liberation in favor of figuring out how we can fund something right now. That might be important in the moment, but where are we in 6 months when that grant runs out?
Absolutely.
So what's a more sustainable route, and how do we make sure that money isn't dirty in some way.
Or compromised, right? Or just fleeting. And so I love that. I love Makia's words there. Our movement deserves the same level of attention, of money, of funding, of of consideration and sort of taking both of those beautiful quotes that you pulled there as application. I think they work so well together, and in sort of us thinking about, as you say, the short-term things, the long-term things, and what we need, right, and what we must demand to make those things happen. I love that.
Thank you.
When I was thinking about application, I thought about the fact that what I love most about these pieces, these kinds of pieces, like the ones you've brought to the table today, is how all of it is application, right?
It's all connected.
It's all connected. It's all really sort of tangible. Like we can leave with with motivation and with ideas and questions to consider. I think we all have to be committed to this work, right? These pieces remind me we all have to be committed to this work. To really keep abolition at the forefront of our calls for action, our practices with one another, our demands of our elected officials, and so on and so forth. And I think that's so important now more than ever, given the current state of our country. And so I pulled a quote as well from Makia Green. They ended their piece by sort of reminding us of the urgency of all of this. So they said, quote, "If we wish to win in the long run, we need to continue making their work possible. In 2020, our movement saw the most significant influx of resources ever. Those resources helped grow strong teams, deepen skills, solidify movement infrastructure, and win real victories. As we look ahead, I call on our movement and our philanthropy partners to sustain this investment at the scale it will take to win. Our opposition has a long-term vision, and so must we. We will walk into 2024 fighting for abolitionist safety and freedoms by every means necessary." Yeah. So, I think that quote aligns with obviously the quote you read too, but I just thought it was a really great way to end the brilliance of their piece.
Yeah, and I think, they say that our opposition has a long-term vision. They also have deep pockets.
Pockets, yes.
Deep pockets. And so that's also something to, fight against and name and recognize that that's something that has been uneven for a long time in terms of
Forever.
where the money is on different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about homework.
All right.
What do we have for homework this week? How are we going to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today? Mine is to dive into an article that was linked in Andrea Ritchie's piece.
Okay.
Called "Are the Cops in Our Heads and Hearts" by Paula Rojas, which was originally printed in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which is a book that was edited by the Incite Women of Color Against Violence collective. And the article dives into the, quote, contradictions found in organizing work here in the United States, and looks like a really great critique of how, the nonprofit sector sort of, in a way, leeches community organizing out, and there's not as much cooperation as there could be from nonprofits, and the way that funding becomes a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Like all those kind of things, I think, is grappled with in this article.
Wow. It sounds like a fascinating article, like super, super useful, and certainly right up our alley to talk about. So I love that. For me, I want to check out Interrupting Criminalization's discussion guide. In Andrew Ritchie's piece, it was sort of one of the, I mentioned at the top, like this was an edited from her remarks. And so the Forge added in some links and some references and some ideas for further learning. And so they linked this discussion guide called Abolition and the State, a discussion tool. And it's actually something that just recently I saw on Interrupting Criminalization social media, and I've been wanting to check out. And so then I saw it here, and I'm like, this feels timely, right? And so it looks to be a really great guide and resource to help abolitionist organizers dream about the future by answering questions like, what do we imagine and advocate for instead of police and policing? What actions and behaviors do we think should be regulated by the state? And how and by whom do we think resources should be distributed? And so questions like that, there's also great activities and questions and resources and stories in it that I think are just super helpful. And so I definitely want to check that out as homework.
That was mentioned in a few different spots.
Yeah, okay,
linked in a few different spots in that article, along with the resource we did, the toolkit we did,
Talk
read
about,
from them.
Yep.
A while ago.
It was a while ago, right?
Yeah. But Yeah, interrupting criminalization always has great stuff about that takes you into deep thought and reflection on stuff and good activities. So I'm sure it's going to be a great thing to check out.
Yes.
So yeah,
Good homework all around.
All right. Well, you're up next time. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am. So just earlier today, I was on Insta, and our friends over at Hammer and Hope posted on their story a piece from their most recent edition, and it just caught my attention. And I thought about it because I was like, do I bring another piece? We just talked about a piece from Hammer and Hope, but in my mind, I love their work. I love what they're doing. I don't think we can bring too much Hammer and Hope, right?
Probably not.
Okay, great. So you're on board with this. You don't really have a choice.
It's your turn. Do what you want.
So the piece I'm bringing is called "The Supreme Court Shouldn't Get the Last Word." It was written by Braxton Brewington, who is a community organizer and a spokesperson for the Debt Collective, who are more friends of ours. And I didn't read the piece fully at all because it's a long one, but the piece seems to explore some of the most recent Supreme Court rulings in this context from a debt abolitionist perspective. It also talks about the left and the right's reactions around those rulings and the Supreme Court in general. And then this notion of what we should and could consider as it relates to the future of the Supreme Court. And so this piece strikes me as sort of a really interesting thought piece.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to check it out and sort of see what we think of it and where our conversation could go.
Yeah, I reviewed that when I brought the piece that I brought from our last time we talked about Hammer and Hope.
Yeah.
And I don't think I read all of it, but I read chunks of it.
Okay.
It's a good one.
Okay.
So yeah, it should be a great discussion.
I'm excited.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for this week. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share a podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, check us out on YouTube, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes, which we just might be able to announce here soon.
Hey, all right. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next time.